in our studies of 1 Timothy, and we're now in chapter 6. And we're just going to look at 2 verses, but I don't think I'm going to get through the 2 verses tonight. Because it is interesting, I've called this faith, work, and witness. Faith, work, and witness. And Paul's instructions to Timothy have all been about the Christian glorifying God through their actions, through their attitudes and activities. He has been stressing the importance about our interactions that we have with one another in our relationships. And he's addressed issues in the churches that needed to be corrected so those relationships could be effective. Now, in these final 2 verses, he's addressing the issue of slaves. In particular, Christian slaves and how they should conduct themselves in everything that they do, even though they were slaves. Now, Paul has stressed again the importance of relationships and how our actions and interactions are important, particularly how we are as Christians to honour and respect people. We're to extend grace to others in the same way that Christ has extended that grace to us and continues to do so every day. In the church, we're to conduct ourselves in such a way that it brings honour and glory to the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, when we look at these 2 verses, we look at them as I did and thought, what am I going to do with this? Because is there anyone here who, I'm not asking if you feel like a slave, but considers themselves a slave today? Raise your hand. Oh, we've got one person that feels that there are 2 people who feel that they're slaves. All right. We're going to deal with that because initially we think, it's modern day pastor, get on with it. We've got no slaves here. So this is not something that's relevant to us today. Can we just move on and discuss other things? If I do that, we miss out on some important principles, and we're going to deal with it. Because we need to have, well, let's define, what is a slave? A servant? Owned by a master? Yes. That's why I said, who feels as though they're a slave today? In that context. All right. Well, in that sense, a spiritual sense, we're slaves or servants to God. All of us. And we need to keep that in mind. But we need to have an adjustment, a perspective adjustment, because when I talk about slaves, that's really an image that we see. A person in stocks and chained with their arms and feet in shackles and, somebody over the top of them whipping them, telling them what to do. That's a perspective we have of what a slave does, particularly in the Roman times. It has been estimated that there was something between 50 to 60 million slaves throughout the Roman Empire over a long period of time. Think about it, 50 to 60 million slaves. People who were slaves in the Roman Empire. And they provided most of the labour for the major cities such as Ephesus, Rome, and Corinth. All that work, all that labour, guess where it came from? Slaves. Slaves. And if you attended the church at Ephesus, where Timothy was the pastor, then it was a certainty that many of those in the congregation were Christians and they were slaves or ex-slaves or even masters who employed slaves in their personal household. That was what was found amongst the people in Ephesus. Now, as you could understand, if you were a slave and you were in church and your boss is there and he's a Christian as well, and you belong to him, do you think it might have provided a little bit of tension between the master and the slave? Because it would have. And we'll deal with that as we get to verse 2. But there's this underlying tension here in the church at Ephesus between slaves and masters. Now, because as far as the people were concerned and what they taught, everybody was equal as a Christian in the eyes of God. And yet, here they were, the personal property of other Christian men. They didn't see how that could work and how that was possible. Now, from our modern day perspective, when we think of slaves, the images that come to mind are half-naked people, very little clothing, shackled in chains, beaten by whips. They had their rights and freedoms taken away. They worked long hours, very little food. And of course, our social media and all media platforms have promoted these images of oppression and cruelty. And so it's hard for us to get a concept that anyone would volunteer themselves to become a slave. Why would you do that? You know, and it would never cross our minds from those images to think that maybe there were some master or owners who would treat them with grace and respect rather than treat them with cruelty and abuse because they were his possessions for life. But you know, the scriptures present us with some interesting perspectives that we need to adjust. At the time of writing of Paul to Timothy, according to Roman law, they were working on freeing of slaves, and it was encouraged throughout society, meaning that the masters who had these slaves as their possession were expected to set them free after 5 or 6 years of servitude. They would be free to go and do what they wanted. Now, I'm not endorsing, nor am I trying to make you think that slavery, particularly Roman slavery or any slavery for that matter, was a good thing, because it certainly wasn't. But slavery in ancient times was very different to slavery in modern times. Very different from what we saw in American history as well. Slavery in ancient times was not based upon race, colour, creed or religion. That wasn't the basis. It was based purely on economic situations. If you were part of a nation that was conquered, then your house was likely destroyed, anything of value you had was taken, and your family would have been taken away. And if you were not killed, then you were left to your own devices in order to survive. This would mean that you were left with the possibility and the potential that you had to promote and sell yourself to some worthy, wealthy, noble family in Rome. So what you did, you indentured yourself to his service for a period of time. In compensation, he would provide you with food, accommodation and wages while you work for him. So most of you here are old enough to know when I was thinking of my time, I was an indentured apprentice. It was called, you did an indentureship. And mine was a 5-year apprenticeship or indentureship. And you had, I've still got it at home, the indenture papers. It was written in the Old English and it's used the Old English language, and if you can go through it and you think, oh, what a lot of rot. But it sets out the obligations of the indentured party, and it sets out the responsibilities of the employer who's, indenturing you to service for 5 years. In effect, you worked for him and he provided you with the skills, he provided you with everything that you needed to become a tradesperson. At the end of 5 years, you were released from that indenture and you could provide a living for yourself. Now, these days, they don't call it indentures, they call it apprenticeships, and they're no longer 5 years, they can be 4 years, 3 years, and what have you. But the idea is that they provided you with what you needed. Now, after you served your time in Rome, you could be free, that would allow you to become a Roman citizen. It allowed you to purchase property. You could become a merchant or a business operator. You could even become a government official. So they were the possibilities that were available. But you had to promote and sell yourself in servitude in order to survive. So it wasn't as though you were just taken away as a slave. Often people volunteered to place themselves in that situation. And you know what? That system worked quite well for so long. And there were abuses to the system in biblical times, and it can be found under the Romans, it can be found under the Greeks. They weren't always the best. Historical records show that Romans, and Greeks for that matter, could be very abusive to slaves at different times, mandating that some slaves could never marry. They took upon themselves to have sexual relationships with women slaves, and when they had children, they simply added them to the indentured slaves they already owned. So there were abuses that took place. The horrible nature of slavery was that they would treat their animals better than many of their slaves. And that shouldn't be a surprise to us. Because even today we can see how there can be abuses, if you like, of any kind, in any society, economically, socially, and employment practices in any society. In other words, there'll always be people who take advantage of others for their own benefits. And that includes government agencies as well. We're experiencing that today with mandates that have been placed upon people, restricting their services and goods. So there are abuses of power that are happening even in modern society. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us that it's happening in then, and it happens today. Now, in our modern society, if we don't like it, what do? Don't tell me we don't do nothing. We protest, we march, we strike. We make a deal about any injustices that we encounter in our workplaces so that our employers are brought to the table and negotiate with us. Now, that's what we do in a modern society. But you know, despite the abuse of some slaves, the system of employment that was happening in Roman times worked out pretty well most of the time. It provided those who were indentured or slaves with some sort of security. It provided them with opportunities to show their skills and get paid for it. It provided them with the opportunity to provide for the needs of their family. But the only way the system could function was if it worked both ways for the master and also for the slave. But for that to happen, the heart has to be right to do the right thing in order to make it work. In our society today, we have learnt from the past. We enter into contract negotiations. We negotiate award rates. We enter into enterprise bargaining. But once again, these things are only successful when the two parties agree and look out for one another. In other words, it's a mutual arrangement and benefit for both parties. That's the only way that it works. But that's what we do today. But here is the crux of the matter. It comes down to our attitude towards these things, particularly for a Christian. Because Jesus Christ doesn't come to start a cultural revolution. He comes to transform and change a heart. That's what he comes to do. He does it from the inside out. He doesn't come to change the status. He doesn't come to change the environment in which you work. What he does do is come to change you as a person. That's what the gospel message does. It changes the individual and the circumstances. Because in effect, when a slave trusted Jesus Christ, when a master trusted Jesus Christ, it didn't change their position or circumstances. They still were slaves, they were still masters, but the change was on the inside. And that's what Jesus Christ does. Now, in our day when it comes to work and we don't like what is happening in our jobs, what do? Quit. Or, hang on, let's not say quit. We look for a better job. We look for a better deal that makes us feel better, don't we? Usually, we have the opportunity to look somewhere else, and we can go somewhere else. We're looking for something better. And yet these verses challenge us and give us principles and tell us this one thing, that as Christians, we need to be the best Christian that we can ever be in whatever situation we find ourselves. Whether it be a slave or whether it be a master. The message is clear. You be the very best you can be. You do the very best you can do. If I put it in my own words, we're being told, suck it up and live in submission to those who have been placed in authority over you. Oh, that's hard to wear. It really is. It isn't a matter of interpretation either. You can't say, well, Pastor, that's not exactly what I think that verse is telling us. It's really telling us that you do the very best you can with a master who's good to you, and the master who's bad, you tell him where to go. That's what those verses tell me. You can't interpret it that way. You might feel that way, but that is not what those verses are saying. The slaves who become Christian were there to represent the Lord as his slaves. And they were to do it with the right attitude. They were to be the best they could be so that Christ's reputation was not destroyed because of anything they did or said. Wow. Now let's look at it. The first is a personal acceptance. All who are slaves under a yoke should show full respect to their masters, so no one will speak against God's name and our teaching. Paul is trying to help us understand the culture and responsibilities that we have regarding others who may have a position of authority over us. When it comes to our work obligations, we have a responsibility to be the very best employee. And I've taken this rather than slaves and masters as employers and employees in the modern sense in applying it. We need to be the very best employees we can. And he uses this image of slave and master in the same way as we use employer and employee to make his point. And sometimes, when we look into the work arena, Christians have not got a very good record when it comes to our attitude regarding work. Sometimes we come across as having a superior attitude, and we're not willing to do the lowly or mundane things. We think it's beneath our dignity to engage ourselves in doing such things. And I was reminded of this week. You know, when you're indentured as an apprenticeship, as an apprentice, and I'm going back into the 60s, the employer took you on. He was investing in you and got very little in return for the first few years. And I can still remember one of the joys of a first-year apprentices. You get to clean up. Drove me nuts. You know, because all the tradesmen would say, come on, Peter, you are the youngest. You're the one that's been put on. You're in your first year. So one of the first things you've got to learn to do is learn how to sweep the floor. I wasn't employed to sweep the floor. Yes, you were. If the boss says clean the floor, clean the floor. If the boss says clean the loo, clean the loo. But how am I learning a trade? Well, you are starting to develop the master-employee relationship because the boss is watching to see what your attitude is. And let's face it, the world does not owe us anything. I can't expect to walk in to an apprenticeship and be paid the top wages when I can't do a thing. You know? But I expect it. And that's what I guess tickles my fancy today when I hear apprentices say, oh, the boss asked me to sweep the floor and I told him where he could go. Well, I knew if I told my boss where to go when I was an apprentice, I'd be the one out the door and that would be it. But you learned to do the mundane jobs. You were developing your character. You were doing what the boss said. He was your boss. He had the authority over you. And let's face it, it takes a few years before apprentices can start to return on the master's investment in your life. You develop skills. You develop something that actually brings him in an income. Before that, he is paying all the bills because you don't know anything. But sweeping the floors is one way you develop character. Cleaning the toilets was another way you develop character. But sometimes we're not very good in our attitude when it comes to doing those things that we say, oh, it's not my job. Somebody else, I can't do that. Because employers see our attitude towards work. And it doesn't take them long to work out and equate our faith with our attitude to work. And so then it becomes a poor witness. When you say, I'm a Christian, I'm serving the Lord. Well, hang on a minute, your attitude is, it doesn't reflect that. Often Christians will try to compartmentalize their lives. And what I mean by that is, they say, this is the sacred, this is the secular. So this is the days in which I will live and do the secular. These are the days in which I'll do the sacred. For example, as a Christian, Sunday is a church day. What should I do? I go to church. I read my Bible. I put money in the plate. I'm submissive to God. I sit under the preaching of the Word of God. I worship as a living God. I'm ready to submit my life to Him for use in His service. On Sundays, that's what I'm here for. However, when it comes to Monday, hang on a minute, this is secular. This is about work. I don't have to submit to my boss. I don't have to submit to his authority. I don't have to place myself under his rules and regulations. He can fire me, I don't care. I'll find another job. This often becomes our attitude. This is what we often show to the pagan world. And Paul's message is, it's not the right thing for a Christian to do. We are to be much better than that. We're to accept the fact that we are where we are, and I emphasize this because God has put us there to be a witness to someone who needs to know about Him. We're in the right place. We're doing what God wants us to do. He wants us to be a witness. And as a slave, I have said, yes, I'll go wherever you want me to go. I'll do whatever you want me to do. And then we say, but don't send me here. Don't get me to do that. Don't put me with this bloke. Don't put me with that woman. Oh, no. Wherever you are is the right place that God has put us to do what He wants. Now the slaves. Oops. All who were slaves under a yoke. We're breaking it down. Paul uses the word for slave as douli, which means a person who is in submission to somebody else. That's what a slave was. Somebody who's in submission to somebody else. As such, that person has the responsibility to obey a master who has authority over them. The whole economic framework in the Middle East and Roman world operated from the foundation of a master-slave relationship. That's how things got done. And it's no different from what we have today in our employee-employer relationships. That's how things get done in business. Now, Paul uses an interesting word for masters. Does anyone know what the Greek word for masters is? You'll laugh at this. The Greek word for masters is despotis. Aha! You got it. It's where we get that word despot, but it's a Greek word that's used for master. Now, it's different from the other Greek word for Lord, which is kurios. This is despotis. And it's referring to someone who has unrestricted authority over another person who is his slave. In our day, a doulos was a person or a slave who was employed to do his duty. His employer, or despotes, has unlimited control over him and tells him what he has to do, and he has to do it. Paul here is introducing to the slaves or employees, and he says, as many slaves or employees as are under the yoke. And he uses this word yoke to describe the relationship that exists between employer and employee as being one of submission. He uses a Greek word, zugos, or yoke. What's a yoke? I'm not talking about an egg yolk either. A wooden yoke that was put two animals together and they worked together in submission. It's an instrument placed around the animals to pull wagons, plows, and whatever was needed to move things around. Now, being under the yoke implies hardship. It implies oppression. These slaves have a hard time of it. They're being treated like oxen, meaning as a slave, you could be bought, you could be sold, and you could be treated worse than an animal. The yoke was a symbol of submissive service. And Paul's message is plain. If any of you are employed in a role of submissive service, meaning you're under the authority of someone else, you are accountable to him for the service you are to provide. In a sense, this is what we do today. We're employed by someone to do a job. In return, we receive wages for the work we do. If we don't work, we don't get paid. We're paid according to the work we do. We offer our services to provide our labour so that that employer can prosper, build up his business, which will be mutually beneficial for us as we're employed in his service. We get the benefits when we work for him. In return, we've got wages, we've got the other benefits. Today, superannuation, holidays, sick pay, all the things our employer is required to take care of as his own expense. Now, we've come to a point today where we expect them or demand them as our rights. But think about it, it's the employer that provides it for us. Submission. Now that's a look at submission, isn't it? He says, should show full respect to their masters. This shows a relationship that should exist between masters and slaves. And what Paul is saying is challenging the slaves, and they're slaves who belong to a pagan or a non-believer. He's challenging them about their attitude towards this position of submission by saying, count your employer, count your master as worthy of all honour. In other words, respect him. Respect him. Now, I can see the wheels ticking over. You've got to be joking, Pastor. I would never allow myself to do that. You've got to be joking. What Paul is saying here is, look, mate, look at the big picture rather than judging things on your feelings, rather than letting your emotions run high. This may not be what you wanted. You may not even like your boss or your master, but understand the position he has. He is your master, or he's your employer. He is providing you with the means to have a living that provides for your families. The least you can do is give him the respect that is due to his position. Respect him. Not saying you to like him, but respect his position. He's your boss. Now remember this, and it's hard for us in our modern day. I'm not the boss. I don't have the worries or concerns. I'm simply offering my services to him. It's not about serving myself. If that's my attitude, then all I'll be motivated to do is about what I want, not about what my employer wants. It's about me. That's why people strike. They don't care about their employment. They don't care what effect it may have on a business. It's about getting what they want. Now, granted, there are many cases of inequity and injustice that some employers have used against employees, and these things have been worked out because of negotiations and the like. But Paul is dealing with slaves who have a master that is a pagan, a non-believer, and he's addressing the issue of a slave's attitude toward his pagan boss. One well-known commentator says this: it's very easy for a person who is spiritually blessed to feel himself superior to a person who is spiritually bankrupt. And his attitude of superiority begins to project itself in the way he responds to his employer. He does so with a lack of respect in the way that he works for him. It's easy for that resentment to build up, and if the guy does things you don't like, says things you don't like, and you don't get along very well, that tendency towards a feeling of superiority is justified and fueled, and it's ready to show in resentment at any opportunity that presents himself to his boss. Now, I have thought about this, and I thought, you know what? I wouldn't like to be an employer today. I really wouldn't. With all the red tape attached to things, with the jumping through hoops to meet state and federal government laws, to provide all the safety protocols and responsibilities necessary to employ our workforce, I wouldn't like to be an employer today. It's easier to be a worker. It really is. You do your work, clock off, clock on, go home, not a worry in the world. Poor employer, what's he got to do? Sit down and work out all the GST and inventories and the like, and it still continues on and on and on. And workplace agreements and disagreements, dealing with union matters, dealing with all those sorts of things. Paul is telling us you need to take into consideration what it is costing the man to employ you and provide for you. He says you are to honour and respect his position and what it entails. You slaves, you Christian slaves who have unbelieving masters, you're under the severity of the yoke. You are treated as oxen. Regard your masters as worthy of honour. That's some statement. He's talking about all masters, even if they're severe. Regard those masters as worthy of honour. And it's a command, it's not a suggestion. The original language in the Greek is a command. It's not if you feel like it, do it. It's a command. This is something, he says, you respect, you honour those in authority over you. Those slaves, even those masters who were severe, were to consider those masters worthy of the same type of honour that they would have in caring for the widows in the church or in caring for the pastors of the church. It's the same word that's used. Respect the position. Respect what they do. They are supposed to take care of the masters in that same way. So during the severity and the difficulty of slaves to non-Christian masters, these Christian slaves were commanded to regard such masters as worthy of all honour. How difficult would that be to put into practice? Now, it's not based here on whether the individual's character or the master's character is good. It's not an issue of whether that individual was worthy of being honoured. He says God has placed you in that situation for a reason. He would not place you in that situation that would be impossible for you, that would be too difficult for you, that you would always and absolutely and forever fall into sin. He placed you in that situation because he believed that he in his grace can provide you with enough strength to see yourself through your journey and bring honour to his name. That's why God has put you there. Now, in a modern day context, if we're having problems with our boss, it's okay to think and say, you know what, my boss is a very difficult person. I'm not going to continue to work for him. I'll resign and I'll take up a position elsewhere. We're free to do that today. Yeah. But we're free to do that. But think about slaves in Paul's day. They had no such freedom. If they had a boss who gave them a hard time, they just couldn't get up and walk away. They couldn't go and make a complaint to the union. There were none. You see, these instructions are important for us today in our relationships with our employers. We are to learn from those who have gone before us, who had to deal with very severe circumstances. And yet when we compare our difficulties with those slaves in Paul's time, we have it pretty good. And Paul commands to these slaves to honour and respect their employers. Very difficult thing to do, but it comes with a responsibility to do. Why? You'll have to come back next week or read the rest of the text. But there's a lot in it. I was just going to skip over them, but this little inner voice said, no, dig, dig, dig. So I dug, and I'm still digging. And so I hope these principles will be a help as we look at faith